Chapter 1, Part 6, of the Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, by William Cooper Nell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by the Progressing America Project. The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. Chapter 1, Continued. Mum Bett. I extract the following account of this remarkable woman from an address delivered in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, February 1831, by Theodore Sedgwick, Esquire, a son of Judge Sedgwick, who had the honor of judicially pronouncing the doom of slavery in Massachusetts under her Bill of Rights. Quote, "We have arrived, by imperceptible degrees, to a point of elevation from which we look down and around, with a sense of superiority, as if the height had been attained by our unaided efforts, and without remembering or regarding the means whereby we ascended. We despise the abject African, because he does not at once leap up to the ascent, upon which we have been placed by circumstances, which we could no more control, than he could have controlled his destiny. Quote, we should look at the subject in a different aspect. We should make all allowances for the different condition of the Africans and ourselves, give them credit for what they have done, and not reproach them for not doing what they had no means of doing. They have the same principle of buoyancy with ourselves, and the instant that the weight which depresses their level in society is taken off, they will rise and occupy the space which is left vacant for them. Quote, such has been my acquaintance with individuals of this race, that I regard the pretense of original and natural superiority in the whites, very much as I regard the tales of ancient fables, setting forth the superior bodily strength of heroes. But for the care of one of this calumniated race, I should not now, probably, be living to give this testimony. Quote, a very slight sketch of the history of the person to whom I refer, may serve to illustrate this argument. Elizabeth Freeman, known afterwards by the name of Mum Bett, was born a slave, and lived in that condition 30 or 40 years. She first lived in Claverack, Columbia County, in the state of New York, in the family of a Mr. Hodgeboom. She was purchased at an early age by Colonel Ashley, of Sheffield, in the county of Berkshire, in the now Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In both these states, and I believe everywhere in the northern states, slavery existed in a very mitigated form. This is not so much to be ascribed to the superior humanity of the people, as to the circumstances of the case. The slaves were comparatively few. Society, except, perhaps, in the capitals, it was a state nearly primitive. The slaves were precluded from the table in but a few families. Their masters and mistresses wrought with the slaves. A great degree of familiarity necessarily resulted from this mode of life. Slavery in New York and New England was so marked, that but a slight difference could be perceived in the condition of slaves and hired servants. The character of the slaves was molded accordingly. Sales were very rare. The same feeling which induces a father to retain a child in his family, or at least under his control, disinclined him from parting with his slave. There was little distinction of rank in the country. The younger slaves not only ate and drank, but played with the children. They thus became familiar companions with each other. The black women were cooks and nurses, and, as such, assisted by their mistresses. There was no great difference between the fare or clothing of black and white laborers. Quote, in this state of familiar intercourse, instances of cruelty were uncommon, and the minds of the slaves were not so much subdued, but that they caused a degree of indignation not much less than if committed upon a freeman. Quote, under this condition of society, while Mum Bett resided in the family of Colonel Ashley, she received a severe wound in a generous attempt to shield her sister. Her mistress, in a fit of passion, resorted to a degree and mode of violence very uncommon in this country. She struck at the weak and timid girl with a heated kitchen shovel. Mum Bett interposed her arm, and received the blow, and she bore the honorable scar it left to the day of her death. The spirit of Mum Bett had not been broken down by ill usage. She resented the insult and outrage, as a white person would have done. She left the house, and neither commands nor entreaties could induce her to return. Her master, Colonel Ashley, resorted to the law to regain possession of his slave. This was shortly after the adoption of the Constitution of Massachusetts. The case was tried at Great Barrington. Mum Bett was declared free, it being, I believe, the first instance, or among the first instances, of the practical application of the Declaration in the Massachusetts Bill of Rights, that "all men are born free and equal." The late Judge Sedgwick had a principal agency in her deliverance. She attached herself to his family as a servant. In that station she remained for many years, and was never entirely disconnected from his family. She was married when young, her husband died soon after, in the Continental service of the Revolutionary War, leaving her with one child. During the residue of her life, she remained a widow. She died in December, 1829, at a very advanced age. She supposed herself to be nearly 100 years old. If there could be a practical refutation of the imagined natural superiority of our race to hers, the life and character of this woman would afford that refutation. She knew her station, and perfectly observed its decorum, yet she had nothing of the submissive or the subdued character which succumbs to superior force, and is the usual result of the state of slavery. On the contrary, without ever claiming superiority, she uniformly, in every case, obtained an ascendancy over all those with whom she was associated in service. Her spirit of fidelity to her employers was such as has never been surpassed. This was exemplified in her whole life. I can convey an idea of it only by the relation of a single incident. The house of Mr. Sedgwick, in this town, Stockbridge, was attacked by a body of insurgents, during the Shays' War, so well remembered in this vicinity. Mr. Sedgwick was then absent in Boston, and Mum Bett was the only guardian of the house. She assured the party that Mr. Sedgwick was absent, but suffered them to search the house to find him, which they did, by feeling under the beds and other places of concealment with the points of their bayonets. She did not attempt to resist, by direct force, the rifling of property, which was one of the objects of the insurgents. She, however, assumed a degree of authority, told the plunderers that they dare not strike a woman, and attended them in their exploring the house, to prevent wanton destruction. She escorted them into the cellar with a large kitchen shovel in her hand, which she intimated that she would use in case of necessity. One of the party broke off the neck of a bottle of porter. She told him that if he or his companions desired to drink porter, she would fetch a corkscrew and draw a cork, and they might drink like gentlemen, but that, if the neck of another bottle should be broken, she would lay the man that broke it flat with her shovel. Upon tasting the liquor, the party decided that, if gentlemen loved such cursed bitter stuff, they might keep it. Understanding, from the conversation of the party, that they intended to take with them, in their retreat, a very fine grey mare that was in the stable, which she had been in the habit of riding, she left the house and went directly to the stable. Before the rioters were apprised of her intention, she led the animal to a gate that opened upon the street, stripped off the halter, and, by a blow with it, incited the mare to a degree of speed that soon put her out of danger from the pursuit of the marauders. Even in her humble station, she had, when occasion required it, an air of command which conferred a degree of dignity, and gave her an ascendancy over those of her rank, which is very unusual in persons of any rank or color. Her determined and resolute character, which enabled her to limit the ravages of a chaise mob, was manifested in her conduct and deportment during her whole life. She claimed no distinction, but it was yielded to her from her superior experience, energy, skill, and sagacity. In her sphere, she had no superior, nor any equal. In the latter part of her life, she was much employed as a nurse. Here she had no competitor. I believe she never lost a child, when she had the care of its mother, at its birth. When a child, wailing in the arms of its mother, heard her steps on the stairway or approaching the door, it ceased to cry. This woman, by her extreme industry and economy, supported a large family of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She could neither read nor write, yet her conversation was instructive, and her society was much sought. She received many visits at her own house, and very frequently received and accepted invitations to pass considerable intervals of time in the families of her friends. Her death, notwithstanding her great age, was deeply lamented. Having known this woman as familiarly as I knew either of my parents, I cannot believe in the moral or physical inferiority of the race to which she belonged. The degradation of the African must have been otherwise caused than by natural inferiority. Civilization has made slow progress in every portion of the earth. Where it has made progress, it proceeds in an accelerated ratio." In 1795, Judge Tucker, of Virginia, propounded to Rev. Dr. Belknap, of Massachusetts, 11 queries respecting the slavery and emancipation of negroes in Massachusetts, which were answered by Dr. Belknap in a very intelligent manner. The queries and replies may be found in the 4th volume of the Collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society. In one of his letters, Dr. Belknap says, quote, "The present Constitution of Massachusetts was established in 1780. The first article of the Declaration of Rights asserts that all men are born free and equal. This was inserted not merely as a moral or political truth, but with a particular view, to establish the liberation of the negroes on a general principle, and so it was understood by the people at large, but some doubted whether this was sufficient. Many of the blacks, taking advantage of the public opinion, and of this general assertion in the Bill of Rights, asked their freedom and obtained it. Others took it without leave. In 1781, at the court in Worcester County, an indictment was found against a white man for assaulting, beating, and imprisoning a black. He was tried at the Supreme Judicial Court in 1783. His defense was that the black, Walker, was his slave, and that the beating, etc., was the necessary restraint and correction by the master. Quote, "The judges and jury were of opinion that he had no right to beat or imprison him. He was found guilty and fined 40 shillings. This decision was a mortal wound to slavery in Massachusetts." End quote. There is no specific record of the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts, and, of course, different versions are given concerning it. John Quincy Adams, in reply to a question put by J.C. Spencer, stated that, quote, "a note had been given for the price of a slave in 1787. This note was sued, and the court ruled that the maker had received no consideration, as a man could not be sold. From that time forward, slavery died in the old Bay State." End quote. I find, in Dr. Belknap's letters, the following account of an early kidnapping enterprise in the city of Boston. The kidnappers were not so successful as others of a more recent date, since they do not seem to have had the state authorities on their side. In the month of February, 1788, says Dr. Belknap, just after the adoption of the present federal constitution by the Convention of Massachusetts, a most flagrant violation of the laws of society and humanity was perpetrated in Boston by one Avery, of Connecticut. By the assistance of another infamous fellow, he decoyed 3 unsuspecting black men on board a vessel which he had chartered, and sent them down into the hold to work. Whilst they were there employed, the vessel came to sail and went to sea, having been previously cleared out for Martinique. Quote, "As soon as this infamous transaction was known, Governor Hancock and M.L. Etumbe, the French consul, wrote letters to the governors of all the islands in the West Indies in favor of the decoyed blacks. The public indignation being greatly excited against the actors in this affair, and against others who had been concerned in the traffic of slaves, it was thought proper to take advantage of the ferment and bring good out of evil. Quote, the 3 blacks who were decoyed were offered for sale at the Danish island of St. Bartholomew. They told their story publicly, which coming to the ears of the governor, he prevented the sale. A Mr. Atherton, of the island, generously became bound for their good behavior for 6 months, in which time letters came informing of their case, and they were permitted to return. Quote, they arrived in Boston on the 20th of July following, and it was a day of jubilee, not only among their countrymen, but among all the friends of justice and humanity." End quote. Extract from a charge delivered to the African Lodge, June 24, 1797, at Menotomy, now West Cambridge, Massachusetts, by the Right Worshipful Prince Hall. Quote, "Beloved brethren of the African Lodge, it is now 5 years since I delivered a charge to you on some parts and points of masonry. As one branch or superstructure of the foundation, I endeavored to show you the duty of a mason to a mason, and of charity and love to all mankind, as the work and image of the great God and the Father of the human race. I shall now attempt to show you that it is our duty to sympathize with our fellow men under their troubles, and with the families of our brethren who are gone, we hope, to the Grand Lodge above. "We are to have sympathy," said he, "but this, after all, is not to be confined to parties or colors, nor to towns or states, nor to a kingdom, but to the kingdoms of the whole earth, over whom Christ the King is head and Grand Master for all in distress. Among these numerous sons and daughters of distress, let us see our friends and brethren, and first let us see them dragged from their native country, by the iron hand of tyranny and oppression, from their dear friends and connections, with weeping eyes and aching hearts, to a strange land, and among a strange people, whose tender mercies are cruel, and there to bear the iron yoke of slavery and cruelty, till death, as a friend, shall relieve them. And must not the unhappy condition of these, our fellow men, draw forth our hearty prayers and wishes for their deliverance from those merchants and traders, whose characters you have described in Revelations 18:11-13. And who knows but these same sort of traders may, in short time, in like manner bewail the loss of the African traffic, to their shame and confusion. The day dawns now in some of the West India Islands. God can and will change their condition and their hearts too, and let Boston and the world know that he hath no respect of persons, and that that bulwark of envy, pride, scorn and contempt, which is so visible in some, shall fall. Jethro, an Ethiopian, gave instructions to his son-in-law, Moses, in establishing government. Exodus 18:22-24. Thus, Moses was not ashamed to be instructed by a black man. Philip was not ashamed to take a seat beside the Ethiopian eunuch, and to instruct him in the gospel. The Grand Master Solomon was not ashamed to hold conference with the Queen of Sheba. Our Grand Master Solomon did not divide the living child, whatever he might do with the dead one, neither did he pretend to make a law to forbid the parties from having free intercourse with one another, without the fear of censure, or be turned out of the synagogue. Now, my brethren, nothing is stable, all things are changeable. Let us seek those things which are sure and steadfast, and let us pray God that, while we remain here, he would give us the grace of patience, and strength to bear up under all our troubles, which to this day, God knows we have our share of. Patience, I say, for were we not possessed of a great measure of it, we could not bear up under the daily insults we meet within the streets of Boston, much more on public days of recreation. How, at such times, are we shamefully abused, and that to such a degree, that we may truly be said to carry our lives in our hands, and the arrows of death are flying about our heads. Helpless women have their clothes torn from their backs, and by whom are these disgraceful and abusive actions committed? Not by the men born and bred in Boston, they are better bred, but by a mob or horde of shameless, low-lived, envious, spiteful persons, some of them, not long since, servants in gentlemen's kitchens, scouring knives, horse tenders, chaise drivers. I was told by a gentleman who saw the filthy behavior in the common, that in all the places he had been in, he never saw so cruel behavior in all his life, and that a slave in the West Indies, on Sundays or holidays, enjoys himself and friends without molestation. Not only this man, but many in town, who have seen their behavior to us, and that, without provocation, 20 or 30 cowards have fallen upon one man. Oh, the patience of the blacks! 'Tis not for want of courage in you, for they know that they do not face you man for man, but in a mob, which we despise, and would rather suffer wrong than to do wrong, to the disturbance of the community, and the disgrace of our reputation, for every good citizen doth honor to the laws of the state where he resides. My brethren, let us not be cast down under these, and many other abuses we at present are laboring under, for the darkest hour is just before the break of day. My brethren, let us remember what a dark day it was with our African brethren, 6 years ago, in the French West Indies. Nothing but the snap of the whip was heard, from morning to evening. Hanging, breaking on the wheel, burning, and all manner of tortures, were inflicted on those unhappy people. But, blessed be God, the scene is changed. They now confess that God hath no respect of persons, and therefore, receive them as their friends, and treat them as brothers. Thus doth Ethiopia stretch forth her hand from slavery to freedom and equality." About this time, the celebrated Prince Sanders was teaching in Boston. He subsequently prepared a compilation of Haitian documents and presented, December 11, 1818, to the American Convention, a memorial for the abolition of slavery and improving the condition of the African race. End of chapter 1, section 6.